started. We apologize about the air conditioning earlier. I wasn't working. It's slowly gradually working out.
I'm going to stay here all night. It's Wednesday. Wednesday's Wednesday.
Please move quickly into your seats. Alright, we're going to start now. Just wanting to quickly welcome everyone back from the break. We did have a couple of comments during the break. I'd like to reassure everyone that this is an academic debate. The question is, what is the focus here? The Godless Delusion? Are the Godless deluded? The Godless are deluded? And so forth. This is what the debate itself is based around, so I ask everyone, again, reinstating what we said earlier, you chose to be here, so again, please obey the rules. If you do comment, and again, from either side, if there are comments yelled out, they will be asked by the nearest volunteer to stand up, and they'll be taken outside. We don't want to take away from the spirit of the debate and the intellectual discussion that's being had, so let's not move away from that. We'll get straight into it. 10 minutes of cross-examination now for Hamza towards Ian, and then it'll be reversed, Ian asking the questions to Hamza. So 10 minutes, Brother Hamza to start.
Okay, brothers and sisters, before I officially begin, I'd like to apologize to my beloved interlocutor for any offense that he may have felt. I am Greek by nature, and we do get passionate, we break plates for God's sake at weddings. So if you felt offended, I do apologize. Also, I apologize for calling him a liar, but to be honest, if you did find it on my website says, even though the quote was taken out of context and I expressed what that actually meant, it's a bit unfair for you to have done that, but anyway, I apologize regardless and unconditionally. And if you like, you may get a hug and a kiss on the forehead as we're doing Greek culture. So, putting that aside, I'd like to ask you a few questions if possible. And I'm going to make a quick statement with some questions. The quick statement is, most of what you said today, especially the second half of the presentation, has nothing to do with the existence of God. Caliphate, Zimmitude, all of these red herrings and things that obviously you haven't read about Sharia law or the Islamic political model in depth. We haven't read a primary source where we went to, again, University of Google. It's got nothing to do with God's existence, so you're losing the debate by not addressing my key premises. So let me bring you back to the key premises, بإذن ta'ala, God willing. The one is on God's existence. I gave you an argument for God's existence from the beginning of the universe. I gave you 4 possibilities. And we have good reasons to believe that there's an uncreated creator with certain attributes or features, which is in line with the Islamic conception of the divine reality. Do you actually have a counter-argument for that? If you do, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I've already given an argument that it's not based on any observations of the real world. They're simple deductive arguments which were supposed to use the premises. So the knowledge we do have about the real world is based on physics and observations of the world as it is now, and the record, the scientific record.
Sure, I just want to stop you there because what you're saying is untrue, because if you understand my premises as well, in other words, deductive in nature, having a deductive argument doesn't necessarily mean it's not based on reality. I mean, if you don't believe in deduction, you're supposed to be a physicist, you don't believe in mathematics, those are deductive abstract truths. Second point you need to understand is, well, we have a lot of interpretations to justify the beginning of the universe. Alexander Belenkin, one of the leading theoretical cosmologists, says that we can't run away from a cosmic beginning. Does it take the spatio-temporal boundary? T is equal to 0. Okay, we have various conceptions. I know that academia says there's not just one opinion, but we have suggested evidence empirically. So how can you say this in a blasé way? I don't understand. I don't have any empirical evidence from the beginning of the universe itself.
Okay, well, it's quite simple. We cannot do any observations before t equals 0. And that includes any observations of the possible creator. That's nothing but speculation.
Okay, let me address that. What you're assuming is what you call very crude empiricism. Empiricism is a theory of knowledge that basically asserts that you need direct and indirect observation to form conclusions about reality. But the point is, there are so many things that are not directly observed, even in science. You have highly complex theoretical constructs and structures, like the atom, like particles, like so many different things. You have correlation, you have energy correlation. The point is, you don't have direct observations for the things that you would believe to be doing in your physics. So why, on one hand, you have very crude empiricism when it comes to religious matters and metaphysics, but on the other hand, you expand the scope of empiricism when it comes to what you think is non-religiously related. I think that's a forced use of empiricism, because you study empiricism, you do the works of John Cunningham in the book Rationalism. You're basically saying that, look, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't just demand direct observation. When it comes to religion, well, you know, do you see my point? So I think what you're addressing is a bit of a red herring. But I want you to actually deal with the primacy. Even if it's deductive. Even if it's deductive. Deal with it. Because being deductive doesn't mean it's not true. So I want you to deal with the premises of the argument. The universe began, we could show this from a mathematical, philosophical, and empirical dimension. We have those sorts of possibilities. Address the premises.
Okay, the universe began, that's an observation, yes. It certainly doesn't come from the Quran, that comes from science. So the Quran has nothing to say about how the universe began.
It does actually. It shows you haven't read the Quran.
Nothing testable, no.
Of course it's testable. It's an assertion. We believe it to be from God and it's divine because we can prove it's a miracle with a linguistic miracle and other things that I spoke about. But it has an assertion, the universe began, God created the cosmos. That's an assertion, it's in line with empirical and deductive reality. So it makes that point. So the point is, if it makes that point, it gives us four logical conclusions. Oh, by the way, the logic I gave you is Quranic. Chapter 52, verse 55 to 56.
I thought the idea was that you asked me questions and I answered them for 10 minutes. It seems to me you've got the back front, you ask me questions for 10 minutes and then I don't get to answer them.
But your answer is not sufficient.
What I said before remains true. If there's no armadillos in the premises, there can be no armadillos in the conclusions. So
what do you mean by that?
So if Quranic science or Islamic science makes no observations of the real world, it can't reach any conclusions about the
That's a
real
red
world.
herring. I'm talking about God's existence. God's existence. We're not talking about Quran here, or Islam, or any metaphysical kind of claim, into the religious claim. We're talking about God's existence.
Okay.
The universe began, we have four possibilities. Address these two things. You either have to reject the beginning of the universe and go back to the 1950s, or you have to reject the logic. The point is, you need to address these two things. Talking about the Quran is a bit of a red herring. Address the premise. Did the universe begin?
Excuse me,
Yeah.
would you like me to answer it, or would you like me to just listen to you answer
But
it?
you're not understanding the question. I have to repeat it many times, sir.
Okay, well there are no gods in the premises because no God has ever been observed. Full stop. Therefore, there can be no gods in the conclusions. Is that simple enough for you?
No, that's terrible. Listen to this.
It's true, however.
So are you saying to me that indirect observation, indirect kind of evidence is not suitable evidence? To claim that you undermine
not
the
evidence.
entire corpus of science. The point
Excuse
is, this is your argument. Let me repeat for you so you have to spit it. Universe began, it could either come from nothing, create itself, be ultimately created by something else created, or ultimately created by something that's uncreated. Okay? So the point is, we address all of these. Let me finish.
That doesn't address any of the theories of the origin of the universe. You're just making those up. There's no science in them whatsoever.
There's no
science in those conjectures whatsoever.
I'm so sorry. You either haven't understood the logic or the science. Have you read Professor Krauss's book, The Universe from Nothing?
Of course.
He says that the universe came from nothing, so the science trying to justify its conclusion. Have you read Alexander Belenkin's work? There's science on this issue, so you can't just make a blasé claim and say, oh, there's no science. But actually, the people that you probably admire and follow and revere, and maybe sanctify, the point is that it's in their works. So how can you say there's no science when they actually address some of these issues themselves?
Let me explain again.
Yeah.
There is no God, no element of a God has ever been observed in the real world.
But
Okay, that's my premise. Therefore, there can be no God in the conclusions, despite any amount of clever reasoning and deductive logic that you might wish to go put forth. If there's no God in the observations or the premises, there can be no God in the conclusions.
Okay.
Full stop. Therefore, your argument falls right down.
Let me see how your logic can be applied to reality. There's no observation of my great-great-great-great-grandmother, therefore my great-great-great-grandmother never existed.
Would you like to answer it yourself? I shall. There are many observations of your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and many of them survive through the historical record. That is real evidence.
Where? I don't have his grave or his DNA or photo.
There are many documents. There are documents going back to 2000. Excuse me, Hamza. I thought we were asked to be courteous to each other, which would include allowing me to answer questions without you interrupting.
It's easy for you because it's not true what you say. I have no records. Okay, take my 10th great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, I have no DNA, no historical records. Is this because I'm here? I make the rational inference. You are denying
Let's
rational
go to another
inference.
example. Julius Caesar.
Yes.
There are many physical traces of Julius Caesar. There are paintings and there are drawings and there are busts and there are recorded
It's not
speeches.
my grandfather.
There's lots of evidence that he
You
existed.
see, it's not my grandfather. It's like the fallacy of the undistributed middle. You're making a fallacy here. The point is, your logic can't apply to reality. You deny your own very existence. You see my point? So,
But there is evidence that he existed.
what is this?
You.
That's exactly the point. It's indirect.
You deny the evidence exists and you are the evidence yourself.
Okay.
Does this mean you don't exist?
You
Or
also
you
can't
are
address the God existence issue. Let's go to the Quran, which you obviously haven't read. You have to borrow stuff from John or Stuart or whatever his name is. Right. The Quranic issue. Well, saying having a good living, you read it. I've got many books. Let me tell you something. My argument was, first I defined what a miracle was, then I said it was a literal linguistic miracle, and I talked about the numerical consonants. Please address that premise if you can. And if you misinterpret it, I'll have to do this.
Can you repeat that more slowly, please?
Please, can you address the premise of the argument that we used for the Quran, which I defined what a miracle was in the Islamic spiritual, philosophical, theological tradition. Then I also spoke about the fact that the Quran is a literary miracle. It's an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature. There is no physical causal link. There's no physical causal link between the literary form of the Arabic and the Arabic language itself. There's no naturalistic explanation, so the sign falls to the supernatural. And I also spoke about that we have no naturalistic explanation for the numerical consonants coherence in the Quranic discourse, especially since we wrote over 23-year period for specific times or places. To say that it was for a man is to say that he actually knew the future. So I want you to address those issues. So I think you're right.
The response, and then that's
Sure.
Okay, well you're confusing an absence of evidence with evidence of absence. You're saying that you've never seen any evidence that accounts for the expressions of the Quran as we read them today. Therefore, there is an absence of the Quran. That doesn't follow at all. All it means is that your knowledge is incomplete, which is natural because you weren't there at the time. So again, your argument doesn't stand up at all. And an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the lively exchange between Hamza and Ian. Now it's Ian's turn to cross-examine. So Ian will be asking the questions this time and Hamza to respond. The way it works is up until the 10 minutes, the question can be asked, and after that, it's to respond, we can respond, like we did in this case. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'll return to my first theme of the Quran versus science. I'd like to ask Hamza, when you came to Australia for this debate, did you travel on an aeroplane that was designed by scientific principles or Quranic principles?
Actually, both. Because in order for you to design a plane, you need an impetus for that, some kind of motivation. Now, for example, maybe the engineers have various motivations, like as a religious person, when you read the Quranic discourse, you can't just say, oh, you have to go and do something, you need to explore and investigate. I mean, if you look at Islamic history, you see that, for example, with the pioneers of medicine, we can see like the canon of medicine that was used in Europe for 600 years because the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet peace said, for every disease is a cure, so search for the cure. We have motivations, they don't have to be secular motivations too. So the impetus for these things that actually could be Quranic as well, so I don't see the dichotomy there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. A friend of mine went with her husband to Dubai, where the husband was caught up in a property scam and was detained in Dubai for 4 years as a potential witness in the trial. Now, according to any sort of international law, he would have been allowed to live in prison for 4 years. And as it turned out, he was tried himself and found not guilty, but he's still kept locked up there for no one knows whatever reason, because Sharia law is operating there.
Yes.
And unfortunately, depriving them of their liberty is innocent people. Another case is that the Swedish woman in Dubai was raped by the hotel staff. She was advised not to go to the police, the Islamic police, but she did. And she got imprisoned for rape. Now, I haven't heard you speak out against these outrages against human rights.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because you don't have YouTube. If you had YouTube, you see that I always talk against the likes of the Gulf. Dubai hasn't got Sharia law in place. The examples you've given about Afghanistan, about all these other places, is the very fact that we Muslims had the Arab Spring with their dictators, their despots, they don't represent our tradition. We talk about this day in and day out. What you have to say is the biggest straw man misrepresentation I've ever heard, ever. You think we agree with someone being in prison innocently for 4 years? Do you think that's our tradition? I want to challenge you. You find me a prophetic tradition or Quranic verse that justifies what Dubai did. If you can't do that, then that's shallow scholarship, and you just looked at BBC or Fox News or Googleisms, and you just threw it against Islam because it happens to be a Muslim country. That's terribly unfair. Terribly unfair. For example, in the Islamic tradition, we believe in minority rights, we believe in justice, we believe in judiciary, in truth, in accountability, in so many different political realities that are actually create a just and harmonious society. And what you're doing there is terribly unfair. And in a way, it lacks depth and scholarship because Dubai is not an Islamic state. It's a kingdom. They have kings. They have rulers who don't represent Islam. For example, the whole economic model is not on the Islamic economic model. So, in actual fact, what you're saying there is case against secularism, not case against Islam, because they're secular in origin.
The vast Islamic majority in Dubai, that's the laws that they've put in place.
No, it's not.
I'll ask you another question. In many countries, Islamic countries, girls as young as 8 get sold into marriage to a much older man. Now, in enlightened countries such as Australia, we don't allow women under 18 years of age to give consent to sex because they're not fully mature and are not able to make up their own mind. And so can you tell me your views on that, please? Does that make a break in all of these Islamic countries that practice this tradition? I haven't heard you speaking up against it.
Well, if you spoke with your colleague that I had a debate with a few days ago, you would see that I actually agree with you. Because Islamic principles based on the following. Number 1, no harm. Number 2, physically fit. Number 3, mentally fit. Number 4, social acceptance. You apply those principles, you get different ages, because we don't have a silly, incoherent law, we just put a number. It's unjust. You put principles. And sometimes, you may be 18, you may happen to be 14, you may be 30. I mean, there's some people, especially when I'm from England, they got to tie their shoelaces at 18, their mothers still done, they're not ready for marriage, yeah? So the point is, they're not mentally fit. So the point is, our law is a principled law. We don't say, here's a number. Go beyond that, it's wrong. Because this exposes your secularism. Let me explain why. In Greece, you can marry, I believe, 13. Spain, 12. America, 21. Other places, 16. Other places, 14. England, 16. Even in secular states, they differ. So I get married in one place, I'm a paedophile in another place. So it actually exposes your law. What you've done, you're doing a great. You know what, you should be on my side.
Unfortunately, Hamza, when I went to university, I had to tell the truth. I get a great length to make sure what I'm telling is the truth.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Islamic countries have it around the world, have a great tradition of forcing their children into underage marriage.
Does it mean it's Islam? Does it mean it's Islam?
The Quran says, for example, that a man has the right to have sex with his woman how and when he chooses, in the same way that he can plough his field how and when he chooses.
Okay.
Now, there's no equality there, there's no justice there. It's a simple male domination.
No, it's not, because you know in Islamic law, my wife could divorce me if I'm not satisfying her. Babe, do you know that? Do you know that? You know that? You don't know that because you just prove that you go to the University of Google and the College of YouTube. If you have a sincere discussion with the Muslim community, and this is really sincere advice. Wallahi, by Allah, is sincere advice. By God. I know you're not a bad guy. You're a nice guy. But what's happening here, you're putting a personality across, and the word personality comes with persona in Latin, which means a mask. Let's remove the mask.
Can we address the question?
I do it eloquently in my Greek way. But the point I'm trying to say is this. If you want to engage with the Muslim community, at least have the intellectual epistemic justice and duty to read a basic book. Because if you read about Islamic jurisprudence, you see that the laws for the wife concerning sexual rights are very high. It's the same as the man. They both have to please each other. You know there's a prophetic hadith. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, I'm answering the question, he said, do not go to your wives just like, animals. Make sure you have things like, I'm sorry for the crudeness, it's part of the religion, foreplay. Make sure you make her enjoy it, and you make sure that she has an orgasm. Go to the website, Muslim Matters. It's a famous Islamic blog. They have a many-part series on sexual rights of women, which are fantastic. But in secular society, in a liberal society, they allow pornography, which is male-dominated. The woman always has to please the men. If you study, for example, Danielle Russell, she works in Oxford publications and other feminists, they say in the pornographic society, especially even in Australia where you allow things like prostitution and escort service, it's all to do with the pleasure of the man. But Islam says, no, it's the pleasure of the woman, or she could divorce you. How dare you say something about Islam if you have the problem with your
So that is nonsense. The Quran and the Hadiths and the practice ever since are entirely devoted towards the pleasure and the rights of the male.
Give me the evidence. Give me the evidence. What I've given you was evidence, you're just making a claim. I said there's
You're not showing me any evidence.
I'm saying Prophet Muhammad said, upon whom he peace, that you actually do things like foreplay, that you make sure that she's satisfied in bed. Is that evidence for you? Or do you want to say what Muhammad said?
He also said that you can treat her the same as you would a cow, or a pig. You can plough her cow when you want, as if she was a field, until she's called.
Do you know what that means?
Yes.
If you know the real Arabic, you know what it means. Basically, the Quran also says that we are garments of each other. And when you have a garment, it's like you feel warm and you're close and you're intimate. It's imagery, it's imaginistic language. Now, if you go to the Arabic, basically it means, don't think that pleasing her is just basically penetration. Pleasing her is everywhere. That's the point.
But the point
let me finish.
Hamza.
No, let me finish.
Just straight off the question.
No, you are misreading the Quranic text, because the Quranic text is telling us to ensure that the woman is pleased, and therefore don't concentrate on one area, concentrate on all areas. It's actually a very postmodern document from that perspective.
The problem is, you can please her whether she wants it or not.
No.
She doesn't have any say in it.
Look, the Prophet Muhammad said there is no harming and no reciprocation.
Anyway, I'd like to move on.
Oh, because you don't like the answers?
No, because you're not answering it. So the next question is, the Sharia law says very clearly, when a woman reaches a certain age, if they divorce, the man can divorce her simply by sending the message 3 times, or saying the phrase 3 times. Is that correct?
This is the last question.
Okay. Yet a woman has no such right. And once the children reach a certain age, the man gets all the property. The woman is left with nothing.
So true. another fabrication.
I was involved, when I visited Nepal, I was part of the delegation to write part of the new constitution. And that covered many countries in the region, including Bangladesh and India, which have Islamic populations. And one of the major
But they have
concerns
British
is
penal
property
code,
rights of
old
Islamic
British penal code. Let's be fair. I find this very, very frustrating because you refer to countries like Bangladesh, you have Sheikh Hasina, who's a despot dictator, killing our own people. She's basically,
Sorry, we're talking about Islamic customs, not the ruler of the day.
No.
The Islamic customs are very clear that women are treated as property, as
No,
very inferior beings.
You need to
And
come to
that's
my
why
house,
they
boys.
use all human
Come
rights.
to my house. You need to come to my house. Who's the property?
Question anyway. But this is great. You know what? I really love you for this. I'll tell you why. It just shows to me you have no arguments against God's existence, which is the topic of today. No arguments against the Quran. You just want to go to culture and society and reinvent your own debate question. It shows to me you don't have an answer on these key philosophical questions. But to address the point, look, Bangladesh is not an Islamic state. It's a despot. My friend was tortured for 16 months in Bangladesh because pro-secular activists in England wrote a press release lying about my friend who run a Green Crescent charity. We have the documents and they're coming out very soon to expose the fallacy of the secular hate.
In
Let me
Islamic
finish.
society, not your brother.
You know what? Ask the women. They'll put you in your place. Go ask. Not to me. I'm not a woman. Ask the women. You tell me they are emancipated. They don't have to pay for their education. They don't have to pay the food, shelter, clothing. They don't have to pay for their own makeup. You tell that to David Cameron. You tell that to David Cameron who has 80,000 homeless people, homeless women, and women are going to prostitution because of no money. In an Islamic state, a woman is an honor. She is an honor. She needs to be protected, and she has food, shelter, and clothing. In Australia, you have people. Go to Perth, go to Brisbane. You have the Aborigines women who are drunk and destitute on the roads because of the secular system. Very cheap. Very cheap.
Quiet please. We'll now have 5-minute conclusion from each speaker. There will be no exceed time for any reason. So 5 minutes Hamza for the for and 5 minutes Ian for the against. So please Hamza.
I mean, to be honest, I've made up my mind and I think I'm really looking forward to engaging with the audience because I hope the audience is far more nuanced and doesn't refer to Google and things that even Muslims disagree with, the countries that we believe are not Islamic in any shape or form. If you go to the constitution of Bangladesh, it borrows things from Britain and other places. So it doesn't have an Islamic constitution or basis from that perspective. But I think, just to end, I think what we need to understand is our arguments are strong. As you can see with the great-grandfather and great-grandmother example, we see that his epistemology is incoherent. Epistemology means how to get to know things. But I don't want to use this 5 minutes just to have a bash. I actually want to talk to you directly and not to the interlocutor. We are a cosmic orphan. Okay? We have existential questions. Questions like, what does it mean to exist? Who am I? Why am I? Whose am I? For whom am I? And sometimes, many of you on a Friday night, where am I? So the point here is, my beloved brothers, sisters, and friends in humanity, that these questions sometimes need to be answered so we can be tranquil. And I think today should be a window of opportunity, whether an intellectual one or a spiritual one, for you to open that window of opportunity, to engage with the Islamic discourse in ways that you haven't done before. And I do believe that you're going to transcend that outdated cliches of our beloved interlocutor. And you're going to transcend the outdated cliches and actually really want to engage with the tradition, because everything he has said doesn't have a basis in the Islamic doctrine. He hasn't gone and given me the evidence, and if he has given the evidence, one or two, they've been quote mining, not understanding the context. Just like you're reading Hamlet and thinking that Shakespeare was a jihadist or something. So what I want everyone to do, and I know my personality doesn't come across that way, but again, explain the griefiness for a minute. What I want you guys to do is really take a step back and think, okay, look, we've heard interesting, it was a bit of fun, we had a bit of banter. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is quite severe, it has severe implications, especially from a religious perspective, because we believe in an afterlife. And you have either divine alienation, which is punishment, or eternal bliss. And you have been given the gift of free choice for you to investigate. You've heard some things that you may have never heard before today. So follow the prophetic guidance of Muhammad upon peace, even if you don't believe in him. When he said, the cure to ignorance is to ask and learn. So I want you to proceed and not lie in the Q&A. Also, follow the Quranic discourse when the Quran tells us to reflect, to ponder, and to think. Because the book is a book for humanity. I believe it's not just for me. It's not a sectarian thing. It's not something that, gives me a sense of identity. I had a great humanist secular life with my parents. It's to do with truth. It's to do with thought and looking beyond the cliches and going to Google. And it's very important for us to do this because now is the time when a juncture in humanity that we can't be doing this all the time. Because if you go to my library, I have books on secularism. John Stuart Mill, I have all the original books based on secular philosophy and atheistic thought. And it's unfortunate that he hasn't read the source text of Sharia law or any base document because it's evident in his approach. But at least we believe as Muslims we have a just epistemic duty to knowledge to understand who you are. But please, and I'm being very serious, understand who we are. I can't be giving you evidence about the Prophet Muhammad upon him before he said, and then you to tell me that's not evidence, he didn't say that, you're making things up. Can't you see this is clear as day? Let's connect with one another, let's not pre-frame each other. And I believe we have a very good Q&A. And may God bless you. Assalamu alaikum.
And for 5 minutes, we have Ian now to conclude. After this, we'll have the Q&A session.
Okay, well, for my concluding remarks, I'd like to firstly remind you that all through my engineering career and all through my university lecturing, I have been held accountable for the truth. That's very important to me. Everything I say has to be traceable and backed up and accurate. So everything I've said today, I believe, has been the truth, and if you wish to dispute it, then you can ask me in the Q&A. Now, I'll summarise a little bit about the history of religion again. I'll just remember the model I gave, where each religion was invented by an individual or a group with the idea of gaining power in some form or other over their fellow men. And I'll give you some examples here. For example, this little book is called the Bhagavad Gita, and it forms the basis for the Hindu religion. And it's their version of the origins of the universe and how men should live. And that says things like the soul simultaneously passes into another body at death. Well, that's an ancient tradition which science has shown to be false. We have another book here, the Bible, which of course includes the Old Testament, written many thousands of years ago, gathering together the ancient myths of the day, and the New Testament, about the life of Jesus and his followers. Again, clearly written by groups of people with the aim of gaining power. We have here another book called the Quran, which, as we saw, has also been written by an individual called Muhammad in about the year 623. Well, not written by him, but dictated by him. Again, for the purpose of gaining power, as we saw in some detail. We have another one here called the Tao Te Ching, which is written by Lao Tzu, which was the basis of Taoism and Confucius writings. I could go on. I could talk about, for example, Mary Baker Eddy and so-called Christian Science. I could talk about L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. I could talk about the Book of Mormon and so on. All of these follow the same pattern. An individual or group invented a religion in order to gain power. And some are more or less successful than others. And Islam is no different. Science has shown all of the claims in their holy books, where they make specific claims about the real world, their claims to be wrong. It reflected the knowledge of the day when the book was written. It does not reflect the reality. So one is forced to the conclusion that either their God didn't know how the universe works, or their God did not exist. And the same is true of Islam. We've heard of there's absolutely nothing in the Quran that gives any indication of any knowledge about the world which was not in possession of the people of the day. Science, on the other hand, we have people standing on the shoulders of other people making discoveries that advance on their discoveries. I showed you a slide earlier that showed a chain of deduction and reasoning in scientific development, and that is what we know about the real world. So in summary, religions are all ancient traditions, Islam included. They were created by individuals, and they tell us nothing about the real world, and they can be particularly harmful, as we've seen about the human rights record, and that's why we should oppose them. Thank you.
So we'll go to the Q&A now. Just be mindful of the fact that the topic is the Godless Delusion. Okay, so please stick to the topic. This is a number to SMS if you don't want to ask a question. If you want to SMS it through, it can be asked on your behalf. Also, be respectful of the speakers. You like to ask a question. If they dodge the question, I'll do my best to try and put it back on track. Otherwise, you're not to have a response or a rebut or whatever. You're not part of the debate, you're just observing, and this is your chance to interact in this limited capacity. So we have people with microphones, one up the top and one on the side. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and hopefully we'll get around to as many people as we can. We're cutting Q&A down to 25 minutes instead of the 30 minutes. Alright, we'll go with the first one at the back there, and then we'll work our way through.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question for Ian. Just before that, I'm not any other things correct. My question is, you make two claims. One that you only take observable evidence. There has to at least be some observable reality, on the basis of which you make a claim about the real world, and you hold to the truth of human rights. Any of it. So I want to ask you to present the observable evidence that people have human rights.
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent question. Okay, my view is that facts about the real world rely on observable evidence, and questions of human rights are a matter of choice. So therefore they're not in the same category as scientific truths. For example, if we say that the moon is so many thousand kilometres away, that's physical evidence that can be tested and observed. If we say that women should be treated equal to men, that's not a fact about the universe. That is an opinion. I'm the first to admit that. Having said that, I'll say that the secular party and the other atheist groups that I've mentioned from time to time have chosen to adopt universal human rights based on principles. The first, if you like, a core principle, it could be the sentience of intelligent beings. For example, human beings, to take the simplest example, that all humans have equal rights, and we should respect the wishes and the welfare of all humans. And that is a principle which can't be proven by observation. It's a principle which we freely admit that we've adopted voluntarily. And from that, you can use scientific evidence to flow on to see how we should treat people. Another way we should treat people is to make sure that men and women are treated equally. Does that answer your question?
We'll take the next question from this side of the room. So, we've already got a question over there. Yeah, question up, please.
Yes. Firstly, I must say I think there's been errors of fact on both sides tonight. Firstly, Ian, you quoted the quote about the known unknowns as being attributed to Colin Powell. It's actually Donald Rumsfeld who said that. And I think we should correct that. I'm also of Greek background, Hamza, so I admire, you do have some erudition, but I think your passion sometimes overwhelms you at times, and you do also maybe stray from the path of factualness.
So the question, please.
Yeah, the question, there is one coming. In terms of a strictly defined truth as alleged by various religions, including Islam, I think the evidence is that because it's interpreted by the limited capabilities of men at all times, none of us are divine if that divinity does exist, that we therefore see huge variations even within Islam. We see this, even from the first generation, differences in theological interpretation in Shia and Sunni and Sufi and various other. So there have been differences of interpretation. These differences have led to conflicts, very bloody conflicts between Islam, between Muslims, as well as between Muslims and other religions. So my question is there really a metaphorical basis for religion that has to be seen as metaphorical rather than literalist? Because that leads to concepts such as apostasy, where if you don't believe what I believe, then I can do things to you in the name of God which aren't necessarily nice. And it works both ways, of course.
And therefore God doesn't exist, or therefore Islam is not true. I mean, in a way it's another bit of a red herring concerning this topic today, because when we talk about things to do with interpretation, it doesn't actually deny the fact that that book has a certain source. For example, we know Shakespeare probably most likely to have written Romeo and Juliet, but you have different, if you study English literature, you see there's different kind of literary analyses of Romeo and Juliet. Just because there's different literary analyses of Romeo and Juliet, it doesn't now deny that Shakespeare didn't write it. Homer's Iliad, there's different literary analyses on this. And one of my favorite books in the Greek language is called Zedida el-Bis, which means Hope Wanted, by Andonis Samarakis, an amazing existential writer, post-war writer. And there are many, many, many different analyses on his work. Just because there are various interpretations on his work, it doesn't now follow that he didn't write them. That's the first point. The second point I want to add is, you may have already known that in the Islamic tradition we have something called a scope of interpretation. There's a scope of interpretation which was something admitted by the companions themselves and by the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And interestingly, this scope of interpretation is scoped, and the reason it's scoped because what we did as a community is to preserve the Arabic language and the meanings of the particular words. So I don't see how that question actually denies the basis of the truth of the Islamic tradition at all. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, they say God didn't exist. They just say interpretation leads to differences.
No, that's not true. I give an example. You have different views on liberal foreign policy. You have liberal interventionism. You have those who are not interventionists. And just because, there's different, it's a human reality because we're human agents. And this is the reality of humanity. And interestingly, when you look at the Islamic discourse, when you see the scholars differing, you can't choose a conflict here and there, but I don't think secularism has any more high ground. They've got far more conflict than anything else if you study history properly. Now, you see the scholars will always say, especially when it comes to matters called ijtihad, which is you don't have anything conclusive, you're working hard within the source text of Islam to form a conclusion. All the ulama, the scholars will say, Wallahu alam, and God knows best. And for example, Imam Shafi, one of the amazing scholars of Islam, he would say, when I discuss with someone, I pray to Allah that the truth comes from his mouth. And when he made a conclusion to do with jurisprudence about Islam, he would basically say, I'm 99% true with an element of doubt. So we have a highly, highly nuanced tradition. So if we do read about it properly, I think you see that your question doesn't really apply in its totality.
Okay, so I'll take the next question from the SMSs. So we have a question to Ian, only because Hamza answered last. So Ian, what is your direct evidence that the Prophet Muhammad and his family gained power from Islam?
Sorry, that his Family gained power from...
Yeah, so the question again, what is your direct evidence that the Prophet Muhammad and his family gained power from Islam?
From Islam, okay. Simply the historical record. That differs slightly from the scientific record. Science is based mainly on observations and measurements, whereas the historical record consists of all the data we have handed down by earlier generations of humans. And the historical record can be tested and examined using scientific means. But the history of mankind has been well documented through archaeology and paleontology and geography and many different scientific ways, dating of many types. So we have a very accurate record of what happened in most parts of the world, especially where records were kept, such as the Middle East. So that's how we have an accurate record of the life and times of the Prophet Muhammad.
So just because I have it in front of me, the question was, what is the evidence? So not how did you get it, what is the evidence of how the Prophet Muhammad and his family gained power from Islam?
Well, I mentioned the classes of evidence. All you need to do is go to that evidence. You can go to a library or a museum and you can look up all the items of evidence there. There are many different items, different types as I already mentioned, including documents and archaeological digs.
Okay, thank you, Ian. We'll take the next question for Hamza. So this is directed to Hamza. Okay, great.
Yes, I just have one question. You stated that the Quran is a linguistic miracle, but I've heard many other religions also claim that for their texts. For example, the Taoist for the Alpha Chain, and the Bible.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Slightly slower if you can.
Sorry. You said that the Quran is a linguistic miracle.
Yes.
But I've heard the same claim being made for many other religious texts, like for the Bible and for the Alpha Chain, which I always say is classic and is very short but full of profound thoughts and so on. So, how can they accept your argument as applying to only the Quran and not to these other religious texts?
Okay, good. Well, I think a claim by other religions is irrelevant. I've made a claim, analyze it and assess it. Just because another religion has made a similar claim, it doesn't now follow that my claim is not true. It's a bit of a logical fallacy, right? So what I think we should do is take what I spoke about into consideration. You could speak to me also and give you a whole list of references, and you could investigate that for yourself. What I gave you was the philosophical implications of the argument. If it's true that no one's been able to challenge the Quran, if it's true that when we exhaust the nature of the miraculous language, the Arabic language, and we can't produce the miraculous event, there's no naturalistic explanation. If that is true, then go and investigate it. If some other traditions have made similar claims, it doesn't now follow my claim is not true. That's the point. And secondly, I think you need a little bit wrong. I don't think the Bible claims, or the Tao Te Ching claims to be a linguistic miracle. It claims to have profound wisdom. My argument is not on the meaning of the Quranic discourse or the way it sounds to you. My argument is on the literary structure, which is more observable and objective. Those are two different things, and I hope that clarifies. Thank you.
Thank you for the response. We'll take the next question from that side of the room. So we're going to sort of back and forth. Who do we have? Question in the far corner. This one's to Ian, I assume. Yep, correct.
Sir, would you believe if I tell you that there was a big ship which was loaded with equipment and it went from China to Singapore and then to America and then to Antarctica without any captain or control center?
Sorry, I see there's going to be a follow-up question. Can we just ask the follow-up question right away?
It's just yes or no. I just want the answer.
Oh, that's all?
Yeah, and I'll
Okay, would I believe it?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure I get the drift, but I think you're explaining to me perhaps something that I wouldn't expect and asking me what evidence I would seek to believe it. Well, the first thing I'd do is show me the evidence of this ship existing, if it sounded very unlikely.
But if it did happen, would you believe it?
If the evidence stacked up, I certainly would believe it, yes, of course. I follow the evidence. Do scientists believe things? Scientists don't generally say whether they believe this or that. They say that I have confidence in this or that because the evidence supports it or doesn't support it. So I often say, show me the evidence if I'm confronted with something I don't understand.
Just a final question about that. Then how can you agree this whole universe runs by itself if you were to believe that?
How do I believe that the universe created itself? Is that the question?
Let's say if you were to believe that this ship business that I explained did happen, then would you also then agree that, this whole universe would run by itself? Or there must be a control?
Ah, yes. Thank you. I understand the question. The ship runs by itself. I might accept that. Would the universe run by itself? Well, I showed you a slide before describing the four forces. If we had more time, I could go into each of those forces. I've studied cosmology and physics a fair bit. And what it shows is that the universe, at least within 1 microsecond after the Big Bang, ever since the universe has indeed been running itself. There's no evidence of any intervention. This doesn't mean that it has a remote pilot or anything like that. It's a natural process. Scientists call it a naturalistic explanation of the world, where natural things like the four forces run the universe. And there's certainly no evidence of any god or supernatural being or prophets or holy books that can change that situation. So yes, indeed, I believe that the universe is running itself and has been for 13 billion years.
Okay, thank you for the response, Ian.
Thank you.
We're now going to take an SMS question for Hamza. Hamza, you explained that infinite chains cannot exist. It would have to follow that God does not exist. Please explain.
Yes, I already mentioned that in my presentation with the infinity, and I was talking about infinity chains, by the way. The chains I was talking about is infinite regressive causes, and that's a different story. And I was talking about the actualized physical infinite, that this universe is in a state of infinity, is absurd. This doesn't now follow that God's infinity doesn't exist. Because I even mentioned there are 2 types of infinity we're talking about here, qualitative and quantitative. I'm not talking about mathematics, I'm talking about the philosophical perspective on this issue. And the quantitative infinite is the infinite made up of discrete physical parts. God is uniquely one. God is eternal. His infinity is coherent from that perspective. So it wasn't about infinite chains. But even if you talk about infinite chains, then it doesn't negate God's existence. Why would it negate God's existence? God is not an infinite chain. That's how I basically describe it. What I think you should do is maybe re-clarify your question to understand what you really mean by the question. Because I did address it in my initial presentation, so you could reformulate the question, and as a result of doing so, we can answer it better, inshallah.
Thank you, Hamza. We're going to take a question from this side for Ian. So, the brother at the back who's got the microphone.
So Ian Bryce, I studied at this university and I specialized. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So Ian Bryce, I studied at this university and I specialised in physiotherapy. So first of all, Wikipedia is not a source of accreditation.
Sorry guys, can we just get straight to the question? Just because we're running out of time, there's a lot of questions. Sorry.
There are evolutionary concepts that science has attempted to prove and have failed. In regards to evolution, I want to know where the missing animals are leading from apes to humans. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as regards missing links, there are many, many different fossils that have been identified from many different sites around the world. The fossils linking apes and humans are very well established. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. The main problem is that every time a new fossil is discovered, it splits a gap into 2. So if you talk about the gaps in the fossil record, all of a sudden, instead of 1 gap, you've got 2. So the more fossils they find, the more that the evolution deniers can deny it. And I'll just indicate to you that there's a little book here called The Evolution Deceit, which I picked up at the University of New South Wales. Now that is subtitled The Scientific Collapse of Darwinism and Its Ideological Background, and it's based on the Islamic view. Because evolution isn't mentioned in the Quran, they say that it's wrong. Well, do you realise, especially to the Islamic students who might be studying at a university, to get hold of a book like this which denies half of the fields of that university and disparages all the scientists and researchers around the world who have studied evolution and found that evolution is the best explanation there is and fits all the facts. What an insult to them for an Islamic group to put out this book which denies half of what the university does. So yes, evolution hangs together as a coherent theory, and there is no other theory. The idea that God made it is no explanation at all and has been refuted so much. You can regard it to betting on a football team. If your favourite team has played 10 matches and lost every one, you might think about changing sides. If you've got, if they've lost 100 times to one, you might think about very strongly about it. But the scientific evidence versus religion, the score is not 100 to 1, it's 1 billion to 0. There is zero evidence for any creation, or any God, or any Islam. And there are 1 billion items of evidence in favour of science, which you can find out in any library. So if the score is 1 billion to 0, I suggest it's time to think about changing sides.
Thank you, Ian. We'll take a question from this side for Hamza.
G'day Hamza. I admire your skills at rhetoric and sophistry. My question is regarding... Thank you. You're welcome. My question is regarding your claim that the Quran is miraculous. If it is miraculous, how can it be so misinterpreted by so many such that it splits into, as we heard earlier, Sufism, Sunni, Shia, and which the various branches of Islam which exist all around the world? There's quite a few minority ones, to be aware. And almost since the inception of Islam, they've been busily killing each other. So which is the true one, and which ones need to be wiped out as heretics and apostates, and which ones are correct?
Yeah, it's a very silly one as well. You should never ask a question by insulting someone in the beginning, that's not very nice. But anyway, it doesn't matter. My point is this. I want you to think about your own question. I want to help you get the right intellectual tools to think about your question. Having different interpretations doesn't negate my argument. How does different interpretations of the meaning negate the fact that it's a literary structural miracle? It doesn't. You're talking about human agency, the meaning of the words, you're talking about political interpretations, and you're assuming as well that their interpretation is as a result of going to the text itself. It could be as a result of something external, because a lot of other interpretations we're talking about were as a result of external philosophical influences. So the point is, there's a whole lot of assumptions in your question, and I would even say it doesn't even have to be answered, because your question doesn't deny the fact that this book has numerical coherence, is a unique literary form. As I said, and I spoke to the other gentleman above, who's Greek apparently, that Shakespeare, we know it came from Shakespeare. There's different literary analyses on Shakespeare. Homer, different literary analyses on the works of Homer. John Fletcher, Antonis Samarakis, who wrote The Did and Beast. There are different interpretations. It doesn't follow, and this is what logic teaches us, it doesn't logically follow that since you have a different interpretation and analysis on a literary text, it doesn't deny its authorship, or even the fact that Shakespeare now didn't use the iambic pentameter. For example, the literary form of Shakespeare was the iambic pentameter, the blank verse, trochaic verse. It's one form, but you can have many interpretations because of the meaning of the words that sit within that form. So your question is a red herring. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamza. Next question is again from the SNS. This is to Ian. If secularist morals shift across time in regards to changing social values, will acts such as incest be viewed as accepted in the future? So we'll probably have, just because of time, we'll probably have one last question after this, and then the debate will go.
Now the answer is no. Incest causes all sorts of problems and potential unhappiness, and is certainly not part of the secular outlook.
Oh, sure and sharp. Alright, thanks Ian. Last question for Hamza. Right at the back over there. Last question.
Hello everyone, and hello Hamza, Ian. A lot has been spoken about the Quran tonight, obviously because it is the underpinning of the whole faith. And unlike other religions, in my interpretation, no other religions say that the holy text was written exclusively and by God and never adulterated, unlike the Quran, where it is claimed as the unadulterated word of God, passed down generation after generation perfectly. And so, implicitly, if there are any contradictions within that text, because it is a pure word of God, then either God was confused, which doesn't happen because God is omniscient, or God does not exist. And I feel that there are some contradictions in the Quran that aren't just the result of...
Sorry, sir, can we just get the question?
Okay, they're not diverging misinterpretations. I think that some passages in the Quran directly contradict each other. For example, verse 256 is one of the verses that says that there should be no compulsion in religion because truth will reveal itself. So pretty much, live in that die attitude. But then in verse 929, it says, fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful. Fight until they pay the tax and are obedient. How are those two consistent?
It's extremely consistent because the Quranic interpretive methodology is that you interpret the Quran with the Quran first. Quote mining, misquoting without reading the few verses before and after. It is a typical strategy. Let me give you the tools now to understand the Quran. The Quran is interpreted with the Quran. For example, the Quran mentions in one place those who are guided, they will go to paradise, or these people go to paradise. It doesn't mention whom. In other places, it specifies the people who go to paradise. So sometimes you have general verses, and those general verses are specified elsewhere in the Quran. So, concerning chapter 9, especially the verses that you're talking about, this was to do with a political situation where the polytheists wanted to basically annihilate all the Muslims, convert them back to polytheism, or kill them all. And God, in His infinite mercy, because this is a verse of mercy, because if God says be passive, then there'll be no community left. So what God does, He uses emotive language, and in the context of war, you have to defend yourself, even if you make preemptive strikes because they wanted to annihilate everyone. That, from a legal language point of view, you're not going to say in the context of war, tickle their toes and give them flowers. You're obviously going to have this kind of language. So if you read the verses before, what does God say? God doesn't like transgressors. In other places in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, referring to war, don't transgress. Talks about, if they incline to peace, you incline to peace. So these verses are in the social political context. Do you see? So I think when we have the right tools to understand the Quranic discourse, we won't make such questions, because I think we need. I have these questions all the time on email, and I don't even give them the answer. I give them the tool to say, read the 10 verses before, read the 10 verses after, or read the chapter itself, and read other verses in other chapters related to the same topic. And also read the prophetic traditions that explain these verses too. And if you have those tools, there's absolutely no incoherence at all in any shape or form. So that's probably the best answer to give, is to give the tools to understand the text from that perspective.
Thank you, Hamza. Are you able to sorry, is that it?
Sorry, I have to end it there. We've gone over time, and like you said, that was the last question. Feel free, if Hamza is going to be hanging around, feel free to catch him after if you can. We're just going to end the debate there. I hope everyone benefited from this debate, hearing the two sides of the arguments around the topic, the Godless Delusion. Just finishing off, we'd like to present Hamza and Ian with a small token of gifts for their efforts out here today, coming out from the UK. And it's Islamic Awareness Week at Sydney Uni, so feel free to grab a flyer on your way out. Please use the bottom exits. Do not exit from the side. The side doors will be closed. Use the bottom